The question of whether the United States was justified in using atomic bombs against Japan can be hotly debated. On the one hand, their use on Hiroshima and Nagasaki acted as decisive blows which promptly led to the war's conclusion. Conversely, the fragility of Imperial Japan come August 1945 when compared to the military might of the Allied nations could suggest that the use of such weaponry was unnecessary and even disproportionate when looking at previous events of the war. One suggestion is that the use of the atomic bombs saved lives, for it prevented the need for Operation Downfall and any subsequent engagements that would have claimed more lives. The attack on Hiroshima left approximately 140,000 dead, and a further 74,000 were killed in Nagasaki. Comparatively, some estimations suggested that there could have been between 500,000 to 1 million American casualties, with around 31,000 to 49,000 occurring in the first 30 days. Furthermore, the use of the atomic bombs meant that the Allied nations saved on expenditure on arming aircraft and men for operations, as well as possibly reducing reconstruction costs in Japan. Had the atomic bombs not have been used, it is likely that incendiary bombs and an invasion would have led to greater destruction and greater cost. A second reason that supports the use of atomic bombs was the threat of Soviet expansion into Japan. The USSR's declaration of war against Japan on August 8, 1945, was the day preceding the attack on Nagasaki and the Soviet invasion of Manchuria. Soviet influence in Japan would complicate the USA's position as the primary power and subsequently their post-war ambitions in East Asia. Additionally, the use of nuclear weapons against Japan allows for the culmination of the war more hastily than alternative methods would have allowed. The proposed Operation Downfall was projected to be a long-lasting engagement, continuing into 1946 with Operation Coronet. Japan's societal detachment to the idea of surrender suggests that any invasion would have been met with significant resistance and cost lives. However, the attacks on Hiroshima and Nagasaki meant that these plans never came to fruition, leading the war to reach a swift climax. Conversely, it can also be argued that the use of the atomic bombs was not justified, when considering the effectiveness of the naval blockade and Allied supremacy in the air and the sea. The effects of starvation within Japan had drawn the nation to a state of fragility, and it was likely to capitulate regardless. Furthermore, the creation of Tiger Force by the British allowed for the additional strength of 200 Lancasters across 10 squadrons, capable of working in conjunction with the United States Army Air Force to conduct air raids in a manner conventional to the war prior. Japan's inability to fight a prolonged war was evidenced by its diminished naval and air forces. Furthermore, the effective Allied naval blockade prevented Japan importing raw materials and food from its faltering empire, so it could not sustain nor fuel its military assets and eventually would have succumbed. However, the ethical arguments opposing the use of atomic weapons point to the inhumanity of indiscriminate bombing and the long-term effects of the bombs. The attacks on Hiroshima and Nagasaki killed many thousands of captive Koreans working as forced labourers, with figures reaching as high as 70,000. The indiscriminate nature of the bombings led to the inadvertent deaths of people who were not Japanese. Moreover, anyone who survived the immediate attacks were later subjected to burns, wounds, cancer, and other forms of suffering. As a result, the use of the atomic bombs can be considered disproportionate to the events of the war preceding them, with more conventional raids using incendiaries having worked effectively, meaning the use of the bombs was unjust. Summarily, whilst the use of the Little Boy and Fat Man bombs certainly hastened the end of the Second World War, it is plausible to argue that they were unnecessary and Japan would have succumbed to an invasion or the after effects of the naval blockade around the island. Therefore, the distinction of whether or not the United States were justified in using the technology is hard to determine, for while the bombs ended the war, they may have been unnecessary given other means.